Hey guys, welcome to the session on decoupling, a technique for overcoming bias with David Manley. I'm Melinda Wang and I'll be your MC for this session. You guys are already probably familiar with the drill by now, but we'll be starting off with a pre-recorded talk by David and then transition to a live Q&A session where he'll respond to some of your questions and hopefully most of your questions. And then you can post your questions on the chat box on the right-hand side of this video and also upvote for your favorite questions to push them higher up the queue. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, David. David Manley is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He teaches at the graduate and undergraduate level on a wide range of topics in philosophy. And here's David.
Hello, everyone. My name is David Manley. I teach philosophy at the University of Michigan. And I have started to teach a critical thinking course over the last few years. I looked all over the place for interdisciplinary work on the most systematic ways in which we make errors in our cognition and try to find tools that can help us overcome them. I put those together in a book called Reason Better. And this is one of the tools that I think is most important. It's called decoupling. So, and this is going to help us especially with something called confirmation bias. You've probably heard that term. The way I'm using the term is to mean the tendency to acquire and evaluate evidence in a way that supports our pre-existing views. So these pre-existing views don't have to necessarily be things that we're motivated by, things that we sort of really want to be true or attached to or something. It could just be something that popped into your head and you found plausible. And then you start to notice things that fit with that belief, right? You start to, things that sort of make sense. And you don't notice things that disconfirm it as much. And this is one of the ways that confirmation bias works. And then when we interpret evidence, we see evidence, we sort of interpret in a way that matches the thing that we think is probably already true. So lots of really great evidence on confirmation bias. Well, and I should say that confirmation bias tends to be worse when we are attached, when we do have some motive for that pre-existing beliefs. So if you take a bunch of people who have varying beliefs about something like, let's say, whether capital punishment deters crime. So, you ask people, how confident are you that capital punishment deters crime? And then you give them a bunch of evidence, a pile of evidence in both directions. So maybe a study that goes in one direction, a study that goes another direction. And at the end, you say, now how confident are you about that belief that you started with? And you might hope, well, we gave them some evidence that went in both directions. So you might hope they'd be less confident, but actually almost everybody is more confident in the belief they started with. And in general, people are twice as likely to say that this new mixed evidence on the whole supports the view that they started with more than the other view. And so the problem with this is, since most of the time there's mixed evidence for things, it's very hard to get people to dislodge a belief that they already have. And this can be the case even if they're not sort of particularly attached to it. What's really interesting about these studies too is that people really are trying hard. They are carefully examining the opposing evidence. If you give the test to undergraduate, if you do the study on undergraduates and who know about study methodology and things like that, they'll be picking apart the opposing study. And they'll be saying, I'm being extremely fair. I just never realized how weak the evidence is on the other side. I mean, you say, look, there's a thing called confirmation bias. Let me tell you about it. People who do this study almost always end up more confident in the view that they started with. Okay, go read the studies and see what happens. And people come out and say, so it just so happens in this case, I know you're going to think this is confirmation bias, but it really is just true in this case that the evidence that you gave me on the whole supports my view more, that there are more problems with the study on the other side. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with confirmation bias, very hard thing to overcome. And part of the reason is that we don't see it happening, right? It'd be very convenient if you could just decide to believe something, but it doesn't work like that. We don't want to see that we're affecting the way that we think. And for the most part, these processes are going on sort of under the hood. They're not open to our introspection. So the idea that you should be able to tell just by looking, just by checking to see your motivations, just by checking to see if you feel like you're being biased, that's called the introspection illusion. And what's particularly sort of pernicious about this illusion is that you think you're not being biased because you don't feel like you're being biased. It feels like you're being really fair. and then you look over and your opponent maybe is looking at the very same evidence and comes to a different conclusion, and you think, wow, that person's got to be being biased because they're coming to a different conclusion from the same evidence. And what's more, they should be able to tell that they're being biased, right, by introspecting. And so they're not, they're being dishonest somehow with themselves or with me. They're not really arguing in bad faith because they're biased and they're ignoring the fact that they're biased. So of course, this is going to lead people to generally think about their opponents that they're somehow arguing in bad faith. So although we can't just directly look inside and see how biased we're being, there are things that we can do to sort of step back and ask ourselves, am I in a situation here where I might be in danger of confirmation bias? I think it's very hard in the moment when you're doing the evaluation of evidence. So one thing you could do is notice signs of attachment, because attachment does make confirmation bias worse. So do you feel hungry for evidence? You know, like, oh, look, there's a piece of evidence that supports the thing that I think. Do you feel, do you sort of flinch away from things that might be evidence on the other side? If there's a little like, if there's a thread sticking out of the sweater, so to speak, like something that just doesn't feel a little bit right, do you yank on that thread to see where it's going to go, like you would if it was in your opponent's sweater, or do you just kind of let it go? So this is, if it's feeling like that, that's not something that we do when we're really curious about whether something is true and we really want to know whether it's true. So that's a sign of attachment. And it's not that I think we can avoid attachment. We always should avoid attachment. Of course, there are things that we want to be true. It's just that we have to be especially vigilant in those cases and try some of the techniques that I'm going to be talking about, because there are actually things that can help us overcome confirmation bias. So another thing that we can do is look for something that Jonathan Barron has called belief overkill. So belief overkill is it's essentially when all of the considerations seem to fall in favor of the thing that you happen to think is right. So it's not just that, you know, veganism is more humane and better for the environment, but also once you started to adopt veganism, you start to notice that some people say it's better for your health than any other diet, including the Mediterranean diet. Some people say, you know, maybe there's some reason to think it's better for your cognition. I mean, that might be a bit of a worry because of creatine, who knows. But that, you know, and it feels like maybe it's better for your sex life. You heard that it makes people smell better, and you know, so if you actually start to think that actually yes, all the considerations are in favor of veganism, that might be an indication that we're just at this point collecting sort of ammo, right? We're just sort of, it's an arsenal of reasons, not genuinely being curious about the truth, because these things don't really hang together. There's no reason why, in addition to being the most humane diet, it should also be the most healthy diet, it should also help your sex life. Those are just totally independent things. Very, very lucky that they all fall in the same direction. And you don't need it. We don't need for all those things to be true. If you're a vegan, then you know, probably the fact that it's more humane and better for the environment might be adequate. All right, so then if you notice this belief overkill, then another reason to be especially vigilant. I mean, I might also add, never having changed your mind about something since you were 6 years old is also maybe a bit of a bad sign for confirmation bias as well. So what's going on with the evaluation of evidence when we're affected by confirmation bias is we think that something's already true, and then new evidence that comes along seems like it's probably going to be weak, and if it goes against what we already think, and new evidence that comes along seems like it's going to be strong if it fits what we already think. I mean, even if we're not motivated, it's just like, this is how we think the world is, and so yeah, that study seems plausible because it's, you know, it goes along with how I think that the world is. So the reason that this is pernicious is, well, just imagine a case where you think, there's a 50-50 chance that this particular claim is true. And now I encounter a piece of really strong evidence for the claim and a piece of really strong evidence against the claim, the equally strong evidence. But if biased evaluation is going on, what's happening is I take the one bit of evidence, I become fairly convinced that the claim is probably true. And then when I look at the second bit of evidence, it seems like it's probably not that good. it's not very strong evidence because of the effect of confirmation bias here. And so I end up thinking probably the claim is still true. Or in the other direction, if I had gotten the other bit of evidence first, I think it's probably false. And then I think that the evidence in favor of it is probably bad evidence. And now I end up thinking it's probably false. But the order of the evidence shouldn't matter, right? We started off 50-50. We got 2 bits of evidence that were equally strong. What's going on? We really should end up at 50-50 again. All right, so that's why it's pernicious to let our prior confidence affect the evaluation of the strength of evidence. So what do we want to do? In fact, the way to test the strength of evidence is to completely set aside whether the hypothesis is true. So we're considering whether E, some potential bit of evidence, is evidence for a hypothesis H. Completely set aside whether or not H is true, whether or not we think H is true, and actually do so ask ourselves 2 hypothetical questions. Supposing H is true, how likely is it that we would have observed this fact? Supposing H is false, how likely is it that we would have observed this fact? And actually, in sort of the literature on gathering evidence and updating on evidence, and if you look at sort of statistics and epidemiology and all of this, this is the gold standard for the strength of evidence. You may have heard of like p-values and things like this. In fact, the strength of the evidence expressed as a ratio of these 2 values, which is called Bayes factor, I'm gonna call it the strength factor or just the strength of the evidence. This is the richest and the kind of, this gives us all the information we need to know about the strength of the evidence we're getting. And so, and it has nothing to do with whether we think H is true or not, with how confident we are in H. You know, I guess if H is like a logical contradiction, then that causes problems for this test. But in all other kinds of cases, it's what we're doing is we're asking this purely hypothetical questions. Okay, so like take an example. I noticed that I'm wondering whether my friend is at home. I noticed that that his lights are on, and then I think, is that evidence that he's home? Well, okay, if my friend leaves his lights on all the time, regardless of whether or not he's home, then it's not evidence. Why? Because the observation is just as likely if he's home as if he's not home, right? If my friend is super conscientious, always turns the lights off when he leaves, always keeps them on when he's home, just like a creature of habit like that, then it's very strong evidence. If my friend is, you know, pretty uncareful about these things, then it's some evidence and so on. And it's exactly, this is what we're doing. We're just asking how likely is it that you'd leave the lights on if you're home, and comparing that to how likely is it you'd leave the lights on if you weren't home. All right, so I'll be showing how to integrate these 2 things to come up with a new degree of confidence, to come up with our new, you know, how confident we should be after getting the evidence. So that's the subject of my next talk tomorrow. And by the way, that involves no, you don't need any mathematical background or anything like that. It's a very gentle introduction to Bayesian updating. But the key thing here is we need to decouple that prior confidence that we have from the strength of the new evidence. That is, we need to be able to evaluate the strength of the evidence on its own and not in a way that's colored by that prior confidence. And so, and eventually we're going to put them together to get our new confidence. But the tricky thing here is you can't just tell people to decouple, right? Don't allow your prior confidence to affect how you're evaluating the evidence. That doesn't really work as a strategy because of the introspection illusion, because of, well, something called bias blind spot, where we don't notice that we have a bias, even if we've been told about the existence of this bias and the fact that almost everybody has it. All right, so what do we in fact practically, what are the things that can do? Well, there are some things that work. If you run one of these studies where you give people mixed evidence and then you see how their beliefs are affected, and rather than telling them to just try not to be biased, you say, look, when you consider this piece of evidence, this study, whatever it is, ask yourself how you would have responded to that evidence if you had the opposite view. So, you know, suppose you get a piece of evidence and then you're looking at the study and you just think, ah, this isn't a very good study. It goes against the view that I had. And you ask yourself, well, how would I have treated this study if I had the opposite view? Would I have treated it as like actually pretty strong evidence for my view? And then it becomes a little harder to sort of treat the whatever little flaws you may have found as super important. Or in the other direction, you find something that seems to really support your view and you think, great, this is wonderful. But then you ask yourself, okay, how would I look at this study if I held the opposite view? Well, I probably would have tried to find some flaws, and that might help you notice some flaws you wouldn't have otherwise have found. And there's another similar thing, which is rather than just asking, it might be easier rather than asking what you would have thought if you had the opposite view. You ask yourself, what if I had had this view, but this particular study actually came up with a different result? Would I have evaluated the methodology differently? If the study is in my favor, and I think, great, this is really good evidence for my view. And I think, okay, well, what if this study with this methodology, roughly the same evidence, had actually gone in the other direction, had a different result? Well, I might have found some flaws of the study. I might have treated the evidence a little differently than I actually treated. I might not have sort of wholeheartedly endorsed it. I might have worried about, who's behind who's paying for it or whatever it is. And so what's going on here is this strategy from a Bayesian standpoint is forcing us to decouple the way that we evaluate the evidence from our prior confidence. It's forcing us to do the genuinely hypothetical thing, which is really required to evaluate the strength of the evidence, to step back from what we actually think is true about the hypothesis and just evaluate the evidence on its own merits. And then, of course, we're not just going to forget about past evidence that we have that supports a view or whatever. We're going to then integrate those two things, as we will describe in my talk tomorrow. Thank you very much. I'll take questions now.
Great. Thank you so much for that talk, David. That was very thought-provoking. I'm sure we all learn a lot. So we're going to get started with some of the questions here. The most upvoted question is, so I guess this alludes to System 1 and System 2 thinking that we may be familiar with. So how can you distinguish between the two states? One is you may be an amateur at analyzing evidence. And so you may be more prone to confirmation bias, as you mentioned. But the other state is in which you're an expert in a particular field. And so you're more well-tuned. You have a more well-tuned gut reaction to certain quality arguments. So how would you be able to distinguish between those two states?
Yeah, this is a great question because we sometimes think that System 1 is a thing that we should overlook and always override with System 2, the more sort of conscious, deliberate, aware system. And there is something called skilled intuition, which is really fast and accurate gut judgments, recognizing learned patterns. And people who have a great deal of experience in environments that offer really quick, clear, reliable feedback about the accuracy of those judgments can develop these skilled intuitions where their gut intuitions actually, they might recognize something going on. If maybe you're a doctor, you recognize something going on in a way that you can't quite put words to, or you can't quite articulate. Those kinds of skilled intuitions do exist, but they really require this kind of special environment. And I think we're very often not in those environments. Most people that think that they have skilled intuition of this kind actually don't. Pundits on various types of, just telling us their gut intuitions about things. Ask yourself, have they been in environments where over and over and over, those gut reactions have been tested and they've had clear, quick, reliable feedback? And then also somebody mentioned in the chat that you can actually test the reliability of these intuitions using calibration. So, if you start to feel that something is 80% probable, for example, over and over, you write down the probabilities that you have and then see how often when you're 80% confident in something, it comes out true. And if it's about 80%, then that's great. Your calibration is right on target. But unfortunately, most of the time, I think when people think they have something like skilled intuition, they don't, or at least we should be very careful.
Yeah, so it seems like this development of skilled intuition is something that's habit forming, right? You have to kind of deliberately access it initially, but then it becomes like it's sort of incorporated into a rather like intuitive process. But what are some concrete ways that you'd propose to students for them to like make this a more habit forming practice?
Yeah. Well, if you wanted to develop skilled intuition on some topic, then making sure that you have clear, quick, reliable feedback, that you're actually checking every time that you're actually getting that feedback. Because if it's, and that it's not sort of, what's the word, ambiguous, you know? So for example, people who are predicting the stock market moving up and down will say like, oh, it's going to move up. And then, you know, if eventually it moves up, they say they're right. So you got to have sort of, you're making predictions with clear deadlines, with clear outcomes. You're checking to see how reliable that is. You're getting that feedback. But for lots of kinds of things, we don't get that kind of feedback. And so there's kind of no way for us to develop skilled intuition.
Yeah, which sort of segues into a question that was posed about implicit bias. Yeah, what are some ways that we can like tackle implicit bias in this sense, or can we at all?
So yeah, I guess it's the term implicit bias is it's a bit of a tricky issue. This is something that can be it's a set of associations that can be tested, and you know, you can go and look up sort of the implicit bias test, and it's difficult to know exactly what it means in the sense that like what the outcomes are going to be. For example, you know, in these tests, often you know, Black people come out looking like they implicitly associate being Black with negative attributes, and that doesn't mean that they're racist. It means something like you know, their brain is aware of an association that exists. And so I think implicit bias is a very hard thing to know exactly how to measure and how to, yeah, but how to overcome it, I guess, is like there's ways in which we can sort of quarantine ourselves from certain information that might bias us. So if you're looking at a bunch of, say, applications or resumes, and you could like try to quarantine yourself from facts that might bias you in one direction or another, that aren't relevant to the person's abilities. You can actually take an implicit bias test kind of immediately after having sort of called to mind a paradigm, a sort of anti-stereotype paradigm. And if you do that, then typically the bias goes away for a time, or reduces. And so that's another thing that you can do if you're worried about implicit bias in a particular case, is sort of call to mind a sort of anti-stereotype that will help reduce it.
Yeah, basically just trying to deliberately explore your own cognition and go from there.
Yeah, but I mean, it is tough. The best thing really to do is, if you think there's a fact that could be biasing you that you can actually just blind yourself to, then that's probably the best approach. Because we can't see the ways in which these things are affecting our cognition.
So like selectively picking out what information to consume.
Yeah.
Which is a really challenging problem, because Sam also asked, so like, given that confirmation bias is a major issue in social media, right? In what ways do you think the social media companies or the regulators overseeing these companies can use these techniques to overcome some of the biases that we experience?
Wow, yeah, it's very tricky because we are, you know, they're optimizing for engagement, and the things that engage us are things that we sort of appeal to our confirmation bias and sort of make us think, oh, this is a great example for, you know, the thing that I've always thought about those people on the other side. And so unfortunately, anything that optimizes for engagement like that is going to have the effect of just increasing our confirmation bias, putting us in these kind of, you know, echo chambers that people have been talking about. I'm not sure there's a way, you know, given that that's the sort of model that they have for revenue, that barring some different kind of model, you know, like a subscription service rather than a, where they're not necessarily just like trying to optimize for engagement all the time. It's difficult to know how we would expect them to do otherwise. It's a similar thing with news media.
Great. So given that we've run out of time, I'm going to take one more question about your guide to critical thinking. So Martin asked whether or not it will stay accessible after the conference.
Yes, at least for the next 6 months or so, you'll be able to use that link. And if you ever need it, or it doesn't seem to be working or something, just let me know. Email me.
Okay, wonderful. Could you provide your email address so I can just put it in the chat?
Yeah, dmanley8, DMANLEY, the number 8 @gmail.com.
Okay, I'll get that later. But okay, so that concludes our session on decoupling. Thank you so much for the attendance, guys. And you can submit your feedback in the poll section of the live discussion chat box. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.
Perfect, thank you.